Welcome all of you, and thanks so much for joining. It's great to have you on here. Great to see all of you, and I'm particularly just very excited to be back in a virtual classroom with y'all, and to be starting a new season of formation classes. Obviously, life is quite different than it was last time we were together in a formation room, but I think we're cut out for the task, and it's going to be a wonderful fall. I'm just nothing but thrilled about the class we have planned, and I'm as ever just so thankful to have the opportunity to teach it and lead our conversations together. I've really missed being together in the last several months, so this is really wonderful, and I'm just appreciative of all of y'all being willing to try this out and get online and do the technical work of joining and all that kind of thing. So thank you for being here. I guess at first, I just wanted to sort of begin with some overall matters of introduction and business. The first thing I'll say, and I'll say this a few times through the first couple weeks, but in general, unless I've opened a space for, and sometimes I'll stop my speaking and say, all right, like, are there any comments or questions from the group about this or that? And then people will sort of have the opportunity. But apart from those spaces, unlike our classroom, you'll sort of need to do the work of interrupting me loudly. So if I'm talking, you'll have to unmute yourself and say, Evan, like, I have a question, or something like that. That said, I also need to reiterate, the chat function is not a good way to communicate with me while we're doing this class. I won't see what you're typing there, and you may see it with each other, but teaching and reading chat is too difficult. So I just won't be looking at that at all, and you need to know that in case you're wondering why I'm ignoring what you've written or whatever. So please feel free to speak up, unmute yourself, and just flag my attention if there's something you need to say. Dynamics on Zoom are a bit different as we're all learning, and it won't be perceived as rudeness or anything like that. It's just we're all trying to learn how to navigate this, and so I anticipate a lot of generosity and charity on all our parts in this, me included. So feel free to do that at any point. But that said, I'm going to go ahead and get going with some sort of front matter to the class. Our class this fall is titled, as you see, hopefully on your shared screen there, our class is titled The Prophets, From Jerusalem to Selma. And I just wanted to sort of give you a brief description of my reasons for choosing this topic for our class, and sort of what we'll be doing this fall before getting going on our first day. So you can probably put together, on your own, some of the general reasons why this topic has been selected. And certainly the picture I've selected here of Martin Luther King, is probably indicating to you already sort of the angle or the lens through which I want us to experience this subject matter. But just to say, it has been quite a year and quite a summer for our country, for our church. Amazingly, the two seem to have coincided, and as it is. But it's been, an amazingly complicated time of crisis, really, for our country in many dimensions, not just in terms of a natural sort of disaster like a pandemic, COVID, and the way that we're sort of grappling with that, but also in terms of the social dynamics that make up our society in America, namely the relationships between various racial groups, and most particularly the experience of the Black community in America and of African American communities. People of color in general have this past summer been lifting up their voices to call attention, on the part of the country to what seems to be this country's original sin, if you will, or the main story of the demons that sort of possess our society. And there are huge hot debates going on about whether this is even a real thing, right? Versus debates about what we should do about it. But this is a hotly, contested issue that involves life and death, for many people in our society, and it's become a sort of a crux, or a place where a lot of other major social issues are coming up in conversation, but coming to the fore, really, as we all sort of seek to understand the question itself of racial justice and the experience of those racial groups who've been marginalized and oppressed by the systems that hold up our society. As we seek to understand that, but also as we certainly seek to ask, what then should we do about these questions? I think it's been an amazing time of a remarkable new amount of awareness, which I say with sort of immediate attention to the fact that these voices have been crying out for many, many decades and generations. And this is only a season of sort of a new energy around hearing them. And the distinction is important, that the voices are not new, but the degree to which certain people are willing to listen is. And yet, of course, we know that it's still not enough, the degree to which people are willing to listen in our society. I mean, this kind of conversation is, I think, not only important for us to, consider and get involved in as Christians, but it mirrors very well, the kind of conversations going on in the Hebrew Bible in particular, but especially in the books of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. So that said, thinking about the place that our own culture is in, and I believe the sort of immediate responsibility that we as Christians have to listen to these voices, to engage in these conversations, and to be able to talk about at least what we believe about these things and how we are going to live in light of them as realities in our society. Those Christian responsibilities, I think, compel us to talk as a church right now, and continuing to talk as a church about this question for our society, but especially how it intersects with our tradition and what voices in our own tradition empower us to address and sort of understand and comprehend these conversations. And I would contend that among the most important voices in the history of our Christian and Jewish traditions are the voices of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And that's why I decided this summer that that's what we needed as a church to encounter this fall. I want us to know who the prophets are. I want us to know some of, at least, what they said and how they saw the world and why. Not just to know those things, but to empower ourselves as Christians to look at these conversations going on in our own society and to know how, as Christians, we talk about those things. The prophets, I think, are the best teachers we have for this kind of work. So that's one reason we're getting into the prophets. But that said, there's a kind of a part 2 to our course, and I'll go ahead and advance to our schedule slide. So you can see our plan. Our course moves from sort of an introduction time of about what is prophecy and that kind of thing, to then a middle part about certain Hebrew prophets. So only a few. I've selected a couple important prophets that we're going to encounter, not all of them by any means. But then, as you'll see, for the last 4 sessions, we're going to move into a study of prophets in our own sort of age, our own period of world history. Prophets to the people of God, no less. People who had a message for those calling themselves God's people. And certainly who had things to say to broader society as well, but we're going to be targeted for those who spoke a word to the people of God about who they needed to be in their time and place. These people, I want to argue, stand well in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. And as Christians living in our world today, we need to know why, what it is about them that actually not only sounds kind of like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, but belongs to the tradition of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. How they stand in our own tradition and what parts of our own tradition they're calling us back to. But you'll notice I'm trying to draw our attention this fall to voices that have been incredibly important for the conversation around racial justice in our country, and particularly Black voices. So the last 3 dates of our class will be focused on what I would call Black prophetic figures in American history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is sort of a special case, where Bonhoeffer was certainly not Black, was white and German and even upper class, really, in German society. But what we'll talk about that day is Bonhoeffer's incredibly formative experience in Harlem in his younger years, and in the American South, where Bonhoeffer was deeply influenced by Black theology and the Harlem Renaissance. And that informed his theology about Jesus and an ethic of resistance profoundly for the rest of his life. This is often a totally neglected aspect of Bonhoeffer's work, but I want us to appreciate how Black theology actually undergirds much of what this most important prophetic theologian, white theologian certainly, but much of what he brought to the church in the 20th century. So this second half of the course will teach us sort of to think about important prophetic voices of our own day in light of those prophetic voices from the Hebrew Bible. So that's a bit about sort of my reasons for choosing this topic and the schedule and plan of the class. I'll stop now and just ask before we get going, are there any initial questions about like what I've said this far? Clarifications? Okay. So we're going to go till 12:15. Is that right, Amy? A 1 hour class is what I was planning on, or what were you thinking?
I was thinking till 12, but
right.
If people need to leave before 12:15, they can do that.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I vote 12:15. One vote out there for 12:15.
We had done an hour in the past, so that's why I was thinking that, but maybe things should be different on Zoom, so we can reconvene. Today, if it's all right, I'm going to go till 12:15 because that's what I planned for, and we had some kind of front matter to do, but we may decide to do 12 in the future. We'll come back to that. And yes, of course, those who feel free to leave, those who need to leave, please feel free to do so, and we will be sure to turn on that bell that rings every time someone leaves so we can all look at them and shame them when they do. Just kidding. Never joke about shaming people in a class for leaving early.
Safe space, Evan. Safe space.
That's right. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to move us along to our content for today. And you may have presumed, but just to be clear, today will be mostly me talking and getting us thinking about these issues, whereas in the future there will be more sort of discussion and reflection on the texts that we're encountering. But today I'm going to sort of walk us through a kind of introductory reflection on prophets and prophecy. Feel free to interrupt, of course, if something's not clear. But just to be clear, there won't be large spaces for reflection today and discussion. It'll be mostly listening to the prepared material. So that said, we're going to advance to the question, what is a prophet? This will be our question for today. And for next week, we'll have a class on sort of how to read the prophets, the prophetic literature as Christians. During that class, I'll sort of set a context for Old Testament prophets. We'll talk about the literature and sort of the organization of it and all that. But I'm going to hold off all that kind of wonky subject matter till next week. And this week, I want us to just reflect together on this question, very general question, what is a prophet? And I want us to do so primarily with attention in our minds to the prophets of the Bible. But I also want us to be thinking about those other voices that I held up when we looked at our schedule, sort of thinking ahead to the kinds of people we call prophets in our own society and in our own experience. how we use this word, how it's informed by our sort of experience of biblical prophets, but how it's also morphed to contain more than that or different than that. So this will be our primary question for today, to just get us thinking broadly about the phenomenon of prophecy. And the way I want to get us into it is through a series of statements about what a prophet is. So today I'm going to give you 10 statements about what a prophet is, in order. And I'll just sort of talk through each of them. But these are simple descriptive statements. And before I begin, I'll just say the thing about the word prophet, it can be defined many different ways. It comes from the Greek word prophetes. Just for the record, it means to foresee. And this is kind of an unfortunate thing, that this word is what sort of we've labeled, at least in Greek, the Hebrew prophets as, because just I'll say out of the gate, the Hebrew prophets are not primarily foretellers, not in the sense that we usually mean. They're not future tellers or psychics. They're not, they're not looking into their crystal ball and doing something that nobody else can do, by predicting things magically or whatever. And prophetes can have this connotation in Greek, and the word prophet can often have this connotation, the ability to foresee the future in a linear sense, what is going to happen. That said, prophets certainly do have a lot to say about what's going to happen in the future. But usually it's not about predicting the future. Usually it's about describing the shape of the future for the sake of impacting today, saying something about right now. It's a descriptive relationship to the future, not really a predictive one. We'll get into this more, but I want us to sort of get away from that foretellers of the future kind of way of understanding prophets. But that's what the word means. Definitions, I think, are just not very helpful when it comes to the word prophet. And what I find a lot more useful is description rather than definition, describing together the kinds of things prophets do, what they're like, how we sort of notice them apart from other kinds of people. And that's what we're going to do today with this list of 10 things that prophets are. It's more of a description rather than a definition. So, some of these will apply to some prophets and not others, and, vice versa. But I'm kind of thinking in terms of, Ludwig Wittgenstein talked about family resemblances between things, the way that you can tell something belongs to a group. Maybe not an essence of a thing, but it clearly belongs, right? It's like these other things. So without further ado, let's look at these 10 statements about what a prophet is. First, a prophet shares God's nightmares and dreams. Prophet shares God's nightmares and God's dreams. So prophets are seers in the Old Testament. This is a word that commonly describes a prophet in the Hebrew Bible, that they're a seer. They see things. They see things that other people cannot or will not see. But they often see sort of with God. They see the world as God sees the world, and they see time as God sees time. Sometimes this means experiencing actual visions for a prophet, like Isaiah or Ezekiel. Other times it means perceiving more about present political realities than anyone else does. They're just more perceptive and attentive in the way that God is to society and its life. They're also aware of hope as God is aware of hope. They're aware of doom when it's coming as God is. And it's important to understand that it's this awareness of doom that drives them to examine the life of the people so closely. It's not that they infer doom from a look at the people's life. So it's the other way around. It's actually their sort of sense of doom and hope that drives them to see certain things in society. It's their shared sense of doom with God, through which they read the life of the world. This is what makes them different from just cultural critics, who sort of look at society and draw conclusions about where things are headed based on it. Prophets don't just do that. They actually seem to share a deep sense of hope or doom with God, that drives them to take a look at society from a certain vantage point. Number 2, a prophet speaks like a poet and behaves like an actor. So because the prophet shares God's nightmares and God's dreams, the prophet must also find ways of communicating or enacting those nightmares and dreams. But as we know, dreams and nightmares are not direct, literal pictures of reality, right? They're visions, lenses through which to see reality. So prophets are artists, fundamentally. Their words are often made of poetry and poetic device, and their actions are very often dramatic and symbolic. Prophets do not describe things directly, like, for example, the laws of the Torah do. You get in the Torah, you actually get instruction and direction about how to live justly or how society should look. Rather, prophetic performances often leave people feeling quite confused, shocked, offended, or moved. And yet, people often don't quite understand what they've seen or heard when a prophet speaks to them, even as it moves them. One reason for this is the nature of talk about God. God cannot be conveyed in direct description or rational formulations. The best we can do is sort of constructing poetic images of God or what God is like, and this is what prophets do, rather than speaking so literally about what God wants or who God is. Another reason that prophets speak like this and behave like this is that people are often unwilling to hear or see God's truth. Poetry and art and symbolic action are often able to get under the skin of a society and break its heart in ways that more literal criticism cannot do. I should pause at this moment and say something that you'll hear me talk a lot about through this class. For me, the most powerful contemporary analogy to the prophetic movement in ancient Israel and Judah, which was itself a sort of aesthetic movement among the people, sort of a sociological phenomenon. The best contemporary analogy, I think, in our own world to the prophets of ancient Israel is the hip hop movement in 20th century America, which emerged, you may be aware, emerged during the Harlem Renaissance. Really, it has its proper origins there, but has morphed many times, through the last several generations into what it finally is today. But these are figures in hip hop, figures who often critique society, who speak in ways that are deeply offensive, but incredibly resonant and truthful, who are fundamentally marginalized, as is their genre of music. It's explicit and unacceptable in ways that other explicit imagery and poetry is not, for some reason. And often these artists are really not totally accepted by anyone. They often offend everyone one way or another. Some groups love them a lot 95% of the way, but then there's 5% of them they can't stand. Kendrick Lamar is a favorite rap artist of mine in the current scene, at least. And I think often about the fact that his best album, what I think is To Pimp a Butterfly. I think that's his best album. Was received kind of both ways, poorly and not poorly, because throughout the album he critiques police brutality and sort of the relationship of the government and police to the Black community. But sort of the main punchline of the album is that he calls himself a hypocrite, loudly, and he says he claims that he's a complete hypocrite for critiquing these things because he himself was brought up in and is still involved in violence in these same communities. As a Black person, like, he is violent often toward other Black people, and so he claimed his whole critique is sort of problematic, and he's really wrestling with this in himself. A lot of the Black community actually hated this aspect of the album, really felt like it was sort of victim blaming, in a sense, or not really, kind of pulling his punches. And it just goes to show that, Lamar really tried to give a truthful critique, the full picture. He wants to critique police brutality, but he also felt personally the need to critique himself. And in doing both, he pleased no one. I mean, it was really interesting the way the album was received as an incredible work of art, but not one fan actually liked the whole thing. And that, I think, is something like a prophet, that an artist is clearly saying something true that resonates with people. Nobody doubted that there was truth to what Lamar was saying with his album, but like, everybody doubted that the whole thing was on point, and they had problems with it, and they wrestled with it. We'll do a lot more of that kind of thing as we go, but just for the moment, I wanted to put sort of a picture on the table of the kind of thing I mean when I say that prophets are poets. They're artists, and they convey things through means that are difficult to process and often multifaceted. They're hard to get at directly. They're not authors who sell monographs, books that make one clear claim. They construct different images for their visions, and often these images are offensive and difficult to comprehend, difficult to reconcile. Sometimes even they feel internally contradictory, like Kendrick Lamar's album. But that very feeling is what's meant to provoke new awareness in the listener, or in the hearer. And following directly from that point is number 3. A prophet is not afraid to be offensive. A prophet is not afraid to be offensive. The prophets are dealing with the deepest realities of things, the hope and doom of peoples, life and death. Where many others in a society must be careful to package their messages in a way that will allow them to be truthful while also keeping their job and their institutional affiliation, whether they're a priest or a senator or a teacher. Prophets, on the other hand, package their ideas with a single priority in mind. Their audience will never forget what they have said, and at some point, it will likely understand what they said in a way that redescribes their reality. At one point, for instance, Israelites heard the prophet Amos uttering a funeral dirge in public, going around mourning the death of one who had fallen and, quote, will never rise again. Who is the prophet talking about? The audience wonders. Who has died? They overhear the dirge and they ask the prophet who he's singing for, and he tells them, it's Israel, it's you. They discover that they have died through the hearing of this dirge. This, I don't have to tell you, is profoundly offensive to the hearer. The proclamation that one is dead and hopeless to recover or be redeemed. The prophet is singing a funeral dirge for the very people listening to the funeral dirge. I should also note, a prophet, I think, would make a bad conservative, as you might guess, but they would make an even worse liberal, I would contend. And here's why. Prophets prioritize being memorable and truthful over being respectful. They often simply do not care about political correctness. In other words, a true prophet will offend most everyone, but at different times. And they're impossible to label. or pigeonhole. They are difficult for any one group to claim as their own. Usually there is no group that actually wants to be affiliated with the message of a true prophet, at least not all the time, or not all the way. So like people liked Kendrick Lamar's album as an album against police brutality, but they had much less to say about the main punchline of the album, Lamar's own critique of himself. It didn't work. It didn't align nicely with some of the main political platforms. So they sort of dismiss that part and keep the rest. While other groups highlight that part while dismissing the rest, right? So prophets are not politicians, it follows. They can't be. Nobody votes for them, and nobody pays them. So that's a prophet is not afraid to be offensive. Number 4, a prophet confronts the confident with rebuke and the downcast with hope. So first we need to understand a point about prophets, especially in the Hebrew Bible, in order for this to make sense. First, God summoned and spoke to prophets so that they could minister to the people of their own day. This is very important. And it's important because it runs against the common assumption among Christians today that the prophets in the Old Testament have mainly to do with predictions, and especially with Jesus, or something in the future that comes later. The prophets do have to do with those things. Their literature is important for interpreting what Jesus is about. But the prophets on the ground in 8th century Judah, that is 8 centuries before Jesus emerged in any way, those prophets were invested 100% in their own times and places. Their words and their messages were about the situations in which they lived, the governments that they were under, that they confronted, and the political policies being put into play that week. I realize that's a different sort of approach to the prophets than many Christians may have heard before, but much of this class will make more sense of that, so just go with me for now. But it's important to understand at a base level that prophets, all prophets, are invested in the lives of the people in which they find themselves, not in the lives of people 8 centuries later. But right now, a good poet knows the language of his audience and speaks in it to break their hearts open. So reading the prophets often involves a huge amount of contextualizing them so that we can appreciate their message. All that being said, one of the best definitions of a prophet I've ever heard, if we're going to use a definition, which I caution against, but if we were to use a definition, I would say one of my favorite is a prophet is somebody who knows what time it is. Prophet is somebody who knows what time it is. Prophets bring a word for their time. They embody God's desire to speak to people about the realities, the temptations, the idolatries, and the pressures of their own day. When they do talk about the future and the possibility of hope in the future, the reason they talk about it is to help their audience live well in the present. That is, in light of the real future, not a delusional one, not an imagined mythological one, but in light of the actual direction that people are headed. That's what prophets are about. And for that reason, they often confront, as we say here, the confident with rebuke and the downcast with hope. Number 5, a prophet's task is mostly to speak to the people of God. While the prophets do speak in ways that are significant for all people, their primary significance for us lies in the way they address the people of God. Prophets are people who call the church to be the people of God instead of being an imitation of whatever they encounter in the world. That is to say, prophets who bring a word about God or in the name of God do so often in order to remind the people of God of who they are in ways that are otherwise impossible. Rereading the Torah seems not to have been good enough for some generations in Judah. There it was, right? The book of the covenant, the book of the instructions, and yet reading them over and over again with the same priests and the same temple in the same spaces, sometimes, as we all know, can lead to enshrining the same ways of reading those things that prop up certain institutions, that prop up certain people in power, that underwrite certain mythologies that govern sentiments during a particular time. I mean, look at our own country right now and the amazing amount of people who read the New Testament and excitedly believe that Trump is the incarnation of this figure of hope that the New Testament witnesses to. I mean, it's just a lesson in how, reading the text, the sacred text, hearing from our priests, attending church each week and doing the liturgy can sometimes not be enough, because all of those things can become infected by or subject to the governing sort of stories we tell ourselves of the day. For that reason, the prophet sometimes emerges with poetry, images, actions that tear the hearts open of religious communities in ways that all their rote repetition of sacred tradition can't do.
Evan, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah, Paul, please.
I just wanted to, the figure that you were saying that some religious communities believe that Trump is a vision of or an example of would be a David-like figure. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I just wanted, it's a David-like figure. It's not a Christ-like figure.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, at least in my experience, there are certainly groups that think Trump is like Jesus.
Yeah.
David is a common lens. So is Christ. I've seen a lot of Trump hanging on a cross imagery in the last couple months, and crucified by all the persecuting, whatever. The point being, we can take a symbol and read it onto anything without the help of those who teach us to speak truthfully and to read those symbols truthfully. So yeah, that I agree with what you're saying, Paul.
Right.
So, Evan,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
to kind of piggyback on that, though, it's John.
Yeah, John.
Are there folks out there that would see Trump as a prophet? I mean, he talks about draining the swamp and all that, and I mean, I don't believe that, but I mean, if you do believe him, I guess you could say that he's I mean,
absolutely.
He's like the Apple going against the PC in 1984. And
that's right.
Smashing, right.
Yeah. They go quite down that path, actually. Thinking that he is playing a role in God's future for the world.
Yeah,
right.
Restoration of what,
Right.
Yeah, and
really
righteousness
to get off on this and to get away from your. But I just didn't think that everybody would understand your reference to.
Okay.
About his prophetic role.
I see.
I think there are Christians who would disassociate and would say that no, Trump is not God incarnate, but he is playing a prophetic role in their narrative.
Absolutely. And in fact,
he
go
certainly
ahead,
tears
Ellen.
my heart open.
What did you say? Sorry.
I said he certainly tears my heart open.
Right. Well, I mean, on that point, and just to affirm these points, I mean, I have no trouble saying that Trump is a prophet. we're going to get to the question of false prophets in this class, and how to identify, prophets who know what time it is and prophets who don't know what time it is. Prophets who know who God is and prophets who don't, or who knew who God is and forsook the truth about that. A prophet, though, we'll get to this in a minute, is not necessarily infallible. Prophets lie, and there are such things as false ones. So much of what I'm saying here is taking for granted the sort of truth of the witness of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, but we will encounter prophets that must be identified as not truthful prophets, especially in Jeremiah. We'll get to that. That said, moving on to number 6. A prophet is someone independent of the institutional pressures of church and state. An example is the prophet Amos, who goes around Bethel announcing disaster for the northern kingdom Israel. When Amos does this, Amaziah, the priest at Bethel, or its senior rector, you might call him, urges Amos to stop this and go back to Judah in the south, where his message of the downfall of the north will probably be enjoyed more, and he will probably be able to make a better living. In reply, Amos says that Amaziah has misunderstood Amos's position. He says that he is not a prophet like some of the others who've been employed directly by the king and can be ordered around by one of the king's officials like Amaziah. He also says that he's not a trained prophet like the people who were part of Elijah's discipleship. He also is not the son of a prophet, in his own words. So there seem from Amos's words to be prophets who work for the institutions, and there are prophets who also have been trained in seminaries or something like that to be prophets. Amos distances himself from both kinds. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with being on an institutional payroll. I don't mean to suggest that. But if you are, there will be more difficulties in the way of taking a prophetic stance in relation to the community that pays you. You have your own mouth to feed, and perhaps others as well. It just means other figures will need to be allowed to influence your community. You will need to expose the community to voices like that of Amos, who do not depend on the support of the community. On this note, it's important to understand that prophets are people who are mostly surprised to find themselves in the role they have, and they are often not happy to be there. They are not people who go to seminary to become prophets. That doesn't mean that people who go to seminary can't be prophetic, but it does mean that the people who play the most important and formative roles as prophets in a society are often not those who were trained at a seminary or who have been paid by a church or a government to do so. The experience of a prophetic calling may contradict your life experience so far, like it did with Amos. Or you may well seek to resist the pressure, like Jeremiah did. Or maybe you won't be able to see how you can fulfill such a calling successfully, like Isaiah did. It's extremely difficult to be a prophet, and the stakes could not be higher. Like we were talking about a minute ago, being a false prophet can do catastrophic damage to communities. And Jeremiah comments on how easy it is to deceive oneself into believing that they have a message from God for the people. Considering these things in our own context, we might need to ask, who would be the kind of people that we would not expect to be prophets? Because these are the people God is most likely to use as prophets. Number 7. A prophet is a frightening person who mediates the activity of a frightening God. A prophet is someone who enacts the life and vision of God. They reflect the nature of their God. While God is consistent, reassuring, and encouraging much of the time, God is certainly also mysterious, unpredictable, and even frightening. We should expect then that true prophetic witness will reduce the domestication of God that often characterizes Christianity in America. It will involve our being frightened by some of the things we begin to see and understand about God. At this point, we should understand something. The prophets of the Old Testament took very seriously the claim that there is one God. For that reason, their religion involved a portrait of God that attributed a much wider spectrum of activity to God than we often do. We Christians in our own day are often inclined to forms of dualism or dualistic thinking, in which we project the more frightening aspects of reality onto something like Satan or the forces of evil. You follow that? So as Christians today, we often, in our dualistic thinking, sort of perceive the heavenly realm as being made up of those forces that cause good and those forces that cause evil. And we often call the latter Satan or the devil or something like that. The prophets, however, did not speak in these terms. You'll notice that when you read them. In fact, they seemed to urge against it, which is interesting in tension with our own tradition. They thought the only heavenly being worth recognizing with any real power was Yahweh. So their visions of both hope and doom both involved the action and intention of this God, not other forces. You see how that works? The things that offend us most about some of Israel's prophets, that they would claim that God is the source of terrible, disastrous judgment or catastrophic dealings of, destruction on the unjust. Those very actions for the prophets constitute a claim about the sovereignty and power and oneness of God. So rather than attributing that to sort of chance consequence or evil forces like Satan, the prophets are staunch monotheists. They see God as fully behind the most important movements and actions in history. And that means a broad spectrum of the kind of thing God is about. So their words encompass both wonderful hope, but also terrifying doom. And both are associated with God with no problem. This is certainly one of the things that makes them so offensive to many religious communities. But as you might assume, this is one of the things that means we ought to pay the most attention to them. And we ought to think very carefully about the points in the prophets that offend us, and realize that those are probably the places where we need the most heartbreaking, if you will. Number 8, a prophet intercedes with boldness on behalf of the people to whom they are sent. So prophets don't only bring a word from God to human communities, they also stand in the breach, mediating the needs and plights of human communities to the same God. So as much as prophets preach, they also pray. They pray for the world and for the people they speak to and for themselves. But perhaps most importantly, the force of their prayer is to draw God into the reality of the situation on the ground. So prophets don't just have a word for the people. They also do this amazing thing where they stand between the people they preach to and the God who sends them a message to preach. Part of the impact of this is to sort of expose God to the concrete effects of some of the decisions God makes. It seems that God is sometimes unaware of what it seems or feels like to be human on the other end of God's decisions about Israel. And some prophets bring this to God in a way that really breaks God's heart. In fact, it gets so bad at one point. One of my favorite instances in the prophets is that at one point God has to tell the prophet Jeremiah to not pray on behalf of this people. Isn't that amazing? God forbids Jeremiah from praying for the people of Israel. He says, don't do it. And I think the main reason for this is God knows from God's past that God has a tendency to listen to these prayers. God is often given to changing God's mind about the judgment that God would bring on Israel because a prophet speaks up for them. But in this case, God says, it's been enough. For the sake of my character, for the sake of justice, this has to be done. And so God forbids Jeremiah from praying. That I think that event is just a testament to God's sort of vulnerability to prayer, but also to the power of prophetic prayer and those who stand between communities and God.
We speak French.
Number 9, a prophet ministers in a way that reflects his or her personality and time. As I said earlier, prophets address their own time, not just later ones. A sort of paradox about prophecy is that of all of Scripture, of all the kinds of Scripture, it's prophecy that's described as being most transcendently and directly a word from God. It's the most kind of divine sort of Scripture, if you will. And yet, it's prophecy in which the genuine humanness of the prophets is most bound up in the way the message is delivered. Isn't that interesting? It's a direct word from God, and the humanness of these people is bound up in the way that it's brought. So I think this suggests that God uses people as prophets as the people they are to bring the message they're already able to bring, maybe that they're already bringing. This means that a prophetic word will not often be a shocking and a weird diversion from the sort of thing we might already have expected to hear from someone. If we find ourselves saying, oh, well, that's just what I would have expected them to say, then we should remember that this does not raise questions about whether God is speaking through them. Prophecy comes through human personality, situation, and experience. It does not bypass them. Finally, number 10, perhaps one of the most important to me, at least. A prophet is likely to fail, one way or another. In one sense, prophets fail by making mistakes in their witness. Prophets are not infallible, not even scriptural ones. Prophets are under incredible pressure. Some prophets make mistakes because of fatigue or frustration or rage. Some prophets are overcome by depression or grief or crisis of confidence. And for that reason, they compromise in their work or their witness. Jeremiah had such an experience, and God actually has to come back to Jeremiah and essentially beg him back into the business. And amazingly, God convinces Jeremiah to remain in this business that's just tearing him apart. But there's another more important sense in which prophets are likely to fail. Many prophets make no mistakes in their ministry, but they are unlikely to succeed in achieving the aim that God set before them. Said differently, they are unlikely to break open the hearts of those before whom they enact their witness. In this sense, they are failures, much of the time. In this sense, most of the biblical prophets seem to have been failures. Amos and Hosea failed to halt the moral slide of Ephraim that hit bottom with the fall of the northern capital. Isaiah and Micah failed to halt the slide of Judah that hit bottom during the days of Manasseh. Huldah and Jeremiah failed to halt the further slide that led to the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem and deportations of the people to Babylon. Think also, though, of contemporary prophets. Think of the brutal assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which cut off his prophetic career, and the way his memory has been performatively enshrined in the official consciousness of our own nation, while continuing to systematically ignore the vast majority of his witness. In that sense, prophets are a failure.
From a good source like Washington Post, I'll believe it. But when you read all this dribble from someplace, showing we already had this conversation. Okay, I
Let me see. Hang on. But if all prophets are likely to fail, what is the point of their witness? What's the point of being a prophet, right? If you're likely to fail one way or another. Who would ever do that job? Well, first, the phenomenon of prophecy itself indicates that God stays ever hopeful of a response from the people. The message, "Let my people go," from Moses, one of Israel's greatest prophets, suggests that Pharaoh actually can let them go, that repentance actually can happen, that such problems are not unsolvable. They're problems of here and now, rather, that can be dealt with here and now, if hearts would only break open. Second, while prophetic witness is enacted primarily for the people of the prophet's own time and place, it's often most important for people of other times and places. So prophetic ministry, while it can fail in its own day, can often have amazing power for later generations. I mean, think again of the witness of Martin Luther King Jr., right? His witness was cut short by one who wouldn't hear it, but it has, of course, as we all know, only gained power since then, and it continues to inspire and provoke our hearts to break to this day. And who knows if MLK's witness won't be at its most fullest, in generations to come, right? Who knows the potential of that prophetic witness that we may not have even witnessed yet. Finally, along with this point, I would just point out that with failure usually goes suffering. Prophets not only fail to break the hearts of their people, but the people of God tend to persecute and even murder them for bringing their offensive message, a pattern Jesus pointed to routinely. In fact, Jesus fulfills that vision for Christians. That's what we see in Jesus. And followers of Jesus are expected to live according to this pattern. The very factors that cause God to send prophets, such as people's hard-heartedness and resistance towards God's vision, are also the factors that often mean that prophets will be rejected and persecuted, that same hard-heartedness. Prophets are often, therefore, given the opportunity to make their handling of that experience, that is rejection and persecution, a means of God's reaching their people through their lives and their silence. And they will have the opportunity to make their accepting of persecution an offering to God that helps to compensate for their people's resistance to God. In other words, a prophet's most important witness is often the way in which they're murdered by the very ones they're sent to witness to. In conclusion, then, of all these points, only a fool would want to be a prophet. A wise person would run away from God's summons, like Jonah did. But the person who fails to escape becomes a blessing and finds great fruitfulness. So that's the end of these 10 points about what a prophet is, and I'll look forward to more discussion about them in the future. But I'll just conclude by saying, I hope these 10 points have helped us to think a little bit about what makes a prophet, and will begin us on a trajectory of identifying the things that hold together these characters and these figures that we'll encounter in this class, whether in Judah, Israel, or Selma, Alabama, one way or another. But I think some of these descriptions will help us encounter those characters on sort of the same plane, rather than separating them apart the way we often do, scripture and non-scripture or whatever. That said, that's the conclusion of that. We're at time, very much so, but are there any concluding comments or questions at this point? I'm happy to chat for a few minutes.